Welcome everybody to the second session of the conference on radical thinkers. My name is Ronald Jurissen. I am professor of business ethics here at Nijrode. This series of conferences gives a voice to alternative perspectives at the intersection of business, society and ecology. Radical thinkers does not just mean subversive thinkers, but thinkers who go to the root, radix in Latin, of important questions in our world and who present inspiring views. Our today's speaker is Drenthen, philosopher, associate professor at Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Martin's academic work is in the field of environmental philosophy. We have invited Martin to do a talk in our series because we felt inspired by his view on ecology, on ecocentrism, in particular on how we humans as a species should live together with other species on a finite planet. We, that is Nicolas Chevalier and me, Nicolas is the co-organizer, Nicolas will join us online today. The format of the conference will be as follows. Martin will do a talk of about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, followed by 15 minutes Q&A, and then we will round up. So the whole session will last about an hour. Let's explore radical perspectives. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today at Nijrode, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronald, and thank you for inviting me. An important question: how can humans fit into the natural world? That's what I want to talk about today. I'm starting with a little bit of history of that question, and then move on to what that question might mean today. The field of environmental philosophy that I'm working in basically started in the early 1970s. And one of the earliest papers, a very influential paper, was by the Australian philosopher Richard Rowley, who asked whether or not we need a new ethic to talk about our relationship to nature. According to Rowley, the Western way of thinking about human-nature relationship is dominated by what he called Anthropocentrism, a human-centered perspective in which humans are seen as the measure of all things, and humans are seen as the only things in the world that matter in themselves, that matter morally. Which means that nature can have value, but only to the degree that it is useful to humans. So nature can only have instrumental value. And this perspective is dominant, has been dominating our entire history in the West at least. And it says basically that humans are free to do whatever they want, unless they harm another human being. So no action is wrong unless it harms another human being, and no action is wrong unless it destroys something that is valuable to other human beings. Now this anthropocentrism, neatly summarized like this by Rowley, today is less and less obvious to people. Our attitude has changed, and in this article Rowley noticed that as well. He said, as an example, for instance, in this traditional anthropocentrism, because humans are the only ones who matter, if you pollute a river without harming humans using that river, there's nothing wrong with that. Willingly polluting a river is only immoral if it negatively affects other human beings. Well, that was the traditional anthropocentric view, but Rowley quickly noticed that today we have a different view. More and more people do have problems with polluting a river or polluting the environment, irrespective of the fact that humans suffer from that or not. So for instance, today we know that in Antarctica there's plastic pollution. If you cut up dead seabirds there, you find plastic waste in their stomach, and most people today consider that to be a moral wrong. Now that means, according to Rowley, that some actions are apparently wrong even if no humans are harmed. Well, this means that this anthropocentrism is no longer the dominant trait, or at least there is a rise of alternative views. And those alternative views have been becoming more and more popular ever since then, and a lot of philosophers have made an overview, as it were, of what can these alternatives be. And there's this gliding scale of anthropocentric views, basic attitudes towards nature, and more non-anthropocentric views. And the most anthropocentric view is called man as the despot over nature, which basically means This is an attitude in which humans consider nature merely a collection of resources that humans can use at their own disposal. We may use nature in whatever way we want. We can extract resources from nature, we can exploit nature, and there's nothing wrong with that. And this traditional attitude is shifting these days already, if only because today we know that it is in our self-interest to not merely exploit nature. Yes, the enlightened ruler would say, yes, humans are allowed to use nature, but they should do that wisely out of a sense of self-interest. You should use nature in such a way that you can sustain that use in the future. And some people use this as a definition of sustainability. A fairly narrow sense of sustainability, because it's still an anthropocentric view. The only reason why we should respect nature is because it's good for us humans. But there are more, let's say, ecocentric or less anthropocentric views as well. A very famous one, which also is part of the cultural tradition in the West, is the so-called stewardship tradition, made famous by Christian theology, which basically says we should take care of nature. We have a responsibility to care for nature, manage nature maybe, and not just out of a sense of interest, self-interest, but also out of a sense of responsibility. And in Christianity, this responsibility was typically voiced as nature was given to us by God, and therefore we have a responsibility to take care of nature. A more secular version that you hear today is that people say we borrow nature from future generations. So yes, we do not own nature, we have to be responsibility because future generations also have to have the possibility to experience nature, to use nature, but also to live together with nature. This is a much broader sense of sustainability. You could say this is a green environmental ethics already. Now, there are even more radical non-anthropocentric views. For instance, the view that we should be partners with nature. We should consider nature to be a partner by us, which means that we should learn to cooperate with nature on equal footing. Yes, humans need nature, and yes, humans can use nature for vital needs. But independently of that, nature also has its value, and that should be respected by us. This is a more deeper green environmental ethics that is at the basis, for instance, for new management of rivers, for instance. Ecosystem-based water management is an example of an attitude towards nature that is more inspired by this idea that humans and nature should be partners. And then to make complete this overview of basic attitudes, you also have this idea that humans are participants in nature. So maybe we should stop even distinguishing between humans and nature, but see humans as part of the natural world, as one among many species, which means if you really take that to heart, we should acknowledge that nature has a value in itself, that we are part of that, not just in the biological sense, but in the sense that what it means to be fully human implies that we have this relationship to nature and that we respect nature. This, I would say, is the broadest possible sense of sustainability, in which it's not merely about being able to sustain our use of nature, but find a sustainable way of living together with nature. Well, these senses of sustainability, these different attitudes towards nature, there's a whole plethora of views these days as an alternative for this dominance of anthropocentrism that was traditionally in the West. But that doesn't mean that anthropocentrism has gone. It's still a very strong voice in the way that we protect nature. For instance, if people say, well, why should we protect biodiversity? Well, today, the typical way of talking about the reason why we should protect biodiversity is in terms of ecosystem services. That means we humans gain all kinds of benefits from well-functioning ecosystems. They provide us with all kinds of materials, food, wood, medicines, and so forth. So we should make sure that we protect the rainforest, because there are all these species of plants that might harbor a possibility of cancer medicines in the future, for instance. So nature regulates things that make sure that there are no floods. So if we protect forests, that means that the water flow is regulated. And there are a lot of things in this sense that nature does for us. And the ecosystem service approach, made popular by the United Nations Millennium Assessment, basically says it's good for us to protect nature. There is no conflict between economy and ecology. If you really understand what the meaning of ecology is, what the benefits is that we get from well-functioning ecology, then we should protect nature out of self-interest. And some people even argue that these ecosystem services can be translated into monetary values as well. If we know that nature, for instance, makes sure that water quality is sustained, you can calculate how much it would cost to make artificial water cleaning facility, and you can put a price tag, as it were, on these natural services, on these ecosystem services. And in that way, you could say for anthropocentric reasons, we have a lot of reasons to protect natural systems, ecosystems. But critics say that there is a problem with this approach, and that's non-anthropocentrism that is coming to the fore more and more in these days. Because you can distinguish all those different ecosystem services that are good for us, and some people argue, yes, we should restore nature for these ecosystem services. But some people ask, well, should we restore those ecosystem services, or should we have a more non-anthropocentric perspective on these things, and should we respect nature itself as well, also for reasons that have nothing to do with the usefulness of nature for us humans? So this image, I think, summarizes neatly this criticism of anthropocentrism, and also maybe on the approach to put a price tag on nature. If people say, well, if you really separate these different functions in nature that are good for us, and you protect them, you turn nature into something else, this living context in which all those life forms live together, in which we are part of, is really something different than a collection of useful elements in ecosystems that are useful to us only. So there is this debate about anthropocentrism still going on. Anthropocentrism is still strong, but there are a lot of counter voices, as it were, these days, in which people feel not at ease if anthropocentric perspective would be the only thing. And in recent decades, research has shown that public morality has shifted, and to most people, anthropocentrism is no longer self-evident. Instead, people have different attitudes, but that doesn't mean that people are simply ecocentrists. In reality, there is this mix of perspectives, mix of motives, why we should protect nature, maybe also why we sometimes shouldn't protect nature but exploit it for our own reasons. And in reality, these days, contemporary public morality when it comes to the human-nature relationship is really a mix of different ethical motives, in which human interests play a role, but also there's attention for the adverse effects that human activities might have on non-human nature. And you could say the challenge these days is that we need to strike a balance between these different ethical perspectives. Strike a balance between respecting vital human needs, respecting, let's say, the vulnerable species that need care, that need to be taken care of by us, and maybe also strike a balance between those people that say, well, maybe we should not even think that we should care for everything, but we should leave spaces, wild spaces, wild places in nature where nature can do its own thing, irrespective of what we are there. Maybe we should even stay out of some of these places. Well, this mix of perspective is an interesting, I think, inspiring view, but it is hampered by a philosophical idea that is still very dominant and that complicates matters a little bit. If we look at debates about how we should deal with these vital human interests, vulnerable species, wild places, very often you see this idea that we can separate the landscape in different regions, let's say. This is the three perspectives that I took from work from my colleague Jozef Keulaerts, Henny van der Wind and Jacques Zwart, who worked for the Dutch government and said, well, maybe we should see that there are typically three types of landscapes in the world: functional landscapes, Arcadian landscapes, and wilderness landscapes, and they all have their own ethical perspective that is at place there. So what would that mean then? Well, the functional perspective, broadly speaking, farmland, is a landscape that supports productivity. Landscapes that are made for producing goods for humans. Arcadian landscape is more these, you could say, fairly traditional cultural landscapes in which humans and non-humans have lived together for very often for centuries. And the wilderness image is then the image of for these tracts of lands that where ecological processes are governing what happens in that landscape. And in this view, you could say, well, there are these three different perspectives, three ethical perspectives that all have their own domain in reality. In farmland, we should reason from an anthropocentric perspective because farmland should be judged on how productive it is, how efficient it provides human resources. The Arcadian landscape is maybe more governed by this stewardship view in which humans and nature work together and humans care for other species. And these wildernesses are places where ecocentrism is more in place. That's an ethical view in which humans are at the periphery. It's all about protecting ecological processes themselves. Well, these three perspectives, as I said, it is often assumed that they all have their own domains in space and that you can separate them, and then you can merely ask the question, well, given that we have a particular strand of land, which of these ethical perspectives is more in place? But I would argue that today this doesn't work anymore. This idea that you can have separate domains of reality basically assumes or presumes that humans and nature can be separated. The wilderness is then the place where humans are absent. Functional landscape is the landscape where humans are dominant, where humans are omnipresent. And Arcadian landscapes are these landscapes in which there's a kind of mix between those two, but humans still have a very central role to play. And I would say these days, this idea of dualism, nature and culture as two domains of space, is no longer feasible. If you look at the planet, human footprint is everywhere. Even in the most remote places, as I mentioned, Antarctica, even there human presence is everywhere. So I would say that the real challenge is how we can combine these ethical perspectives all at once in every place on the globe. And for that, I think it's good to translate these three perspectives into something else. And I did that. I will only briefly mention that here because it's a little bit too complicated for this context. But what I really say is that these three ethical perspectives all try to answer to a kind of call by nature. People feel that they should do something, that nature demands something of us. And these different ethics, they give a different answer to a different call from nature. For instance, if you are confronted with the vulnerability of nature, you feel that you are asked to take care of that vulnerability. Now, that's typically I would say, the moral perspective, or maybe the moral experience of nature that motivates nature conservationists, protecting traces of land from human interference, from human destruction, very often very actively caring for nature, very actively managing species and so forth. Wilderness ethics is a more recent strain in nature conservation, where people say, no, nature has this autonomy. Some places in nature can take care of itself, and there it is more important that humans restrain themselves, that they are not thinking that they can manage that or they should manage that, but we should make ourselves not more important than we are, restrain ourselves and let nature be, as it were. That's also a moral experience that asks self-restraint from us. But I would argue that the ethical perspective that governs these functional landscapes, for instance, these farmlands, are also governed by a moral experience of nature. That's something that you don't hear that often. But if you really talk to farmers, they say, I'm not exploiting nature. I see that there are these places of land that are exceptionally good for food production, and it would be unfitting, it would be wrong to just neglect that fact. We should be grateful that there are places in the world that are suitable for food production for humans. We also deserve a place on the planet, so we should have gratitude towards the fertility of nature. And these three ethical perspectives, I would say, they all point to a different aspect in our relationship to nature, and in a way we should take into account all these three perspectives. So that means that we need to find a balance between these three ways of answering to the call of nature, which is we should respect the vulnerability of nature, caring for vulnerable nature, without falling into this trap of wanting to control everything. We should also respect wild nature, restraining ourselves, not wanting to manage everything, without being indifferent for those moments in which we need to intervene because something obviously bad is going to happen if we don't. And then there's the third perspective, the gratitude for the fertility of nature, as I call that, this farmers ethics or this nature use ethics, which claims, yes, nature can provide in our vital needs, and it's justified to use nature for that, but we should not forget about the legitimate claims of other human beings for space, so we shouldn't cultivate the entire globe for food production. And maybe also we should make sure that in those places that we do use for farmland, for instance, we should do that in such a way that the other species living in those places are not killed. So we should have nature inclusive agriculture that respects other living beings living in that productive land as well. Well, this sounds very abstract, and maybe it is, but if you look at more concrete cases, I think we can maybe have a better sense of how this perspectival landscape ethics, in which we have these three demands that pull in different directions and in which we have to find a balance, as it were, how that works. And for me, a very fertile case to talk about this tension is the resurgence of large carnivores in places where humans were not used anymore to these beings. Well, the most obvious example of that is the wolf. The wolf is coming back to the Netherlands. Just yesterday morning, a wolf was sighted in the village near to my home again, and everyone starts panicking because we are not used to having these carnivores, these vicious creatures, these dangerous carnivores living in our landscapes, and people wonder how that should work. And basically there are two responses. Some people don't like wolves and they say they don't belong here. Some people say it's good that wolves are finally back after we eradicated them 150 years ago. And you see these different answers, these different responses to a spontaneous event of nature coming back, if you look closely to that debate, which I have been doing. So one clear thing is that you can see this dualism that I talked about, this idea that nature is in one place and culture and humans belong in the other place, really is also very influential in the way in which we talk about these wolves. We say, well, we have these nature areas, very often fenced off, either to keep humans out or to keep wild animals in, so that we don't have unnecessary conflicts between wild animals roaming through human space. And we can see that if typically normal animals like a roe deer, everyone likes them because they more or less stay in the forest. They don't mess up our gardens, for instance. They don't enter our cities. So we can visit them in the weekend, but they stay in nature. The interesting thing of a wolf is that a wolf doesn't care about these distinctions. And a wolf is a very mobile animal. They walk 70, 80 kilometers a day if they want, which inevitably brings them into cultural landscapes as well. So last couple of years we saw in the Netherlands images like this one. A wolf walking on the street, a wolf walking on the pavement, a wolf using human bridges to cross a river, And many people are uneasy about that. They say, well, this wolf wasn't that a wild animal that belongs in the wildernesses, in the dark wilderness of Eastern Europe, or in the northern Canadian forest, or something like that. And then this image of a wolf walking through our cultural modern landscape doesn't fit that imagery. And if you look at people responding to the wolf and its presence, you can see a similar tension. If wolves are in a nature area, then the nature warden, here you see an image of the nature warden of, I think, the area around Utrecht, where a wolf was sighted, and this park ranger basically says, this is the happiest day of my career because there is finally a wolf in my area. The same day or a few days later, this was another article in the newspaper where Annie Schreier-Pierik, a parliamentarian who is a spokesperson of farmers' interest, say wolves should be shot. And she is talking about wolves entering agricultural land and maybe threatening livestock, like especially sheep. So you see, wolves are welcome in nature areas, wolves are not welcome in cultural areas. And there we see this very same dualism that I talked about. If you look more closely at the problems that people have with wolves, I've collected a couple of arguments, and even people against wolves, they say, I've nothing against wolves, but they belong in the wilderness. They shouldn't be in the Netherlands because the Netherlands is not suitable for wolves. We live in a cultural landscape, which means that the cultural landscape must be managed. Wild nature is not possible here. And now that we talk about it, say a real wild wolf would never come to the Netherlands on its own. There must be something wrong with that. A wolf belongs in the wilderness. So if a wolf decides to enter the Netherlands, there must be something weird going on with that wolf already, because why would a wild animal enter the Netherlands? It must be a tame animal, maybe an escapee from a zoo, maybe a wolf that has been fed by humans and made tame. There is something wrong with a wolf. And maybe you could say the most disturbing thing about a wolf is not so much that wolves occasionally eat sheep, but that it undermines this idea that the wolf belongs in the wilderness, in real nature, and something that we do not have in landscapes like the Netherlands, and maybe in the rest of Western Europe, the same is true. So what is most disturbing about the wolf, I would say, is that the wolf undermines this symbolic order that we have in our heads, that there is a sharp distinction between nature on the one hand and the human world on the other. Cultural landscapes on the one hand and wilderness on the other. And if you see this picture here, this is a very famous small video clip of people who made a video of a wolf walking through a village in the northern Netherlands. You hear people talking, is that a wolf? That's strange, and shouldn't we call someone to let them know that there's a wolf here because there's something weird going on? A British tabloid journal took this image, which is a fairly funny video clip as well. Many people have seen it, and they turn it into this spectacular heading in the newspaper that a terrifying wolf was prowling Dutch streets looking for its next meal, which taps into this idea that wolves are wild, dangerous animals, which in fact was not what happened in this movie clip at all. So maybe the wolf is disturbing this sharp distinction of natural and cultural, but in reality wolves do not inhabit wildernesses, if only because there are not that many wildernesses, but they live in a mix of humanized landscapes with small bushes or something, places where there's a small forest, where it's quiet, where they can raise their young and so forth. And it has been the case for centuries. So the wolf is not an animal of the wild. It lives in the same landscape that we live as well, trying to find its way in that landscape. And well, this is maybe the context that we talk about today. The whole planet is a planet in which humans are present, in which wilderness is in this absolute sense of places that are untouched by humans. do not exist anymore, but it doesn't have to be a problem for a wolf. A wolf is perfectly fine navigating a landscape in which humans live as well. So I think there's an important lesson to this case of the wolf, which is that our landscapes cannot be neatly divided into nature reserves and cultural landscapes. Hasn't been the case today, is not the case today, but hasn't been the case in the past as well. If you look with modern eyes to the past, we see that humans and non-humans have shared the landscape forever. And sharing the landscape also means that we have company, even though very often we are not aware of that. We neglect the fact that we are not just watching nature if you go there to the weekend, but we are being watched as well. The landscape is being occupied, inhabited by other species than humans. And the wolf confronts us with that question, basically. What does that mean? Are we really willing to make room for other beings? Despite our attempt to be non-anthropocentric, the wolf poses this question strongly to us: are we really willing to make room for other beings? Which means that we should take a step back, accept wildness and maybe the uncontrollability in the part of the world, because not everything will be determined by us then. If you take this question seriously, if you take seriously this fact that we share the landscape with other beings, I think there are a couple of lessons that we can draw from that. One important lesson, I think, is that the landscape is not just determined by us, but also not only experienced by us. There are other inhabitants of the landscape, other earth dwellers that live in this landscape, that interpret things as well. So we are not the only one interpreting the meaning of features in the landscape. Again, this sounds abstract, but maybe an example can help understand what I'm talking about. So here you see an apartment building, a flat, and a pigeon. Pigeons used to live on rock faces, on cliffs. And you could say, well, looking at the landscape, looking at the modern urban landscape, means our cities are full of cliffs. A pigeon doesn't see a high-rise building, it sees a rock face. It interprets that building as a rock face, meaning a place where you can nest, a place where you can hide from predators and so forth. Well, if you take this is a nice example, and maybe an innocent example, although some people hate pigeons because they are considered to be the rats of the sky. I'll come back to that later on. But if we take this perspective, see that our landscape is also interpreted by other beings, then maybe also we can realize that we are constantly sending messages to wild animals, even if we are not aware of that. So we live in different worlds of meaning. For us, a high-rise building is a rock face to a pigeon. But maybe also more problematic examples. The example of geese that are now eating the grassland that was meant for our cattle. But why do they do that? Because they see this sign, this big sign in the landscape. Guys, there's a feast going on here. There's this high-protein grass in these fields. Never existed in human history before. So why wouldn't you land there and eat that? And maybe also a little bit more darker example, these unprotected sheep on the dikes in the Netherlands grazing to keep the dikes intact. Well, these unprotected sheep are easy snacks for a wolf passing by. A wolf might have a preference for wild prey, but a wolf roaming through this cultural landscape might be tempted to see these sheep as a quick snack. The important thing is we have to realize that we are communicating with wild animals, that we are sending messages that are being interpreted by other beings, very often not in the way that we intended. Now, if that is true, and if we come to realize this, then we should maybe also realize that that we should do this more consciously. If we share space inevitably with other wild animals, then maybe we should also start negotiating with these animals of how we distribute space. And in order to do that, we have to initiate a learning process in which both sides, both these wild species and us, can learn what it means to live together and to learn what it would mean to live together in such a way that we can avoid conflicts. So wildlife must be able to learn where they can better stay away, and maybe also where they are allowed to be. And humans need to learn that there must be places where these animals can go. So we must realize that the land is not ours alone. Okay, so negotiating space, how do you do that? Well, very many people say in Europe you cannot do that. Why? Because we do not have space. Where do we have space? Well, this place, this is Montana. I lived there for a couple of months, 4 years ago. There's a lot of space here, and there are a lot of wild animals, grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, coyote, mountain lions, and there's a lot of space there. And many people think these are easy places. They're places for wild animals. Humans stay out, and then there's cultural land, and these wild animals stay out. In reality, it's not as clear as that, if only because humans visit these places, but also because there are still villages living in these areas where these wild boars occasionally enter the city. So it's not as clear-cut, but it's an idea that many of us have, that it's impossible to share landscapes. Why? Because this is the typical Dutch landscape, a landscape where that's already in use by humans and human livestock. And what if living spaces overlap? How can we live together with a wolf in a landscape like this? And we're not used to do that. I said already I want to talk about the rats of the sky. Well, these are seagulls, I think. And many people living in cities know that seagulls can be very annoying to live with because they attack us, they see us as a food source, and so forth. And very many people want them gone. So this is not a very optimistic image. If this is the model, how to live with wild animals, well, that might be complicated. But I think we should look at it differently, because we know how to navigate a landscape with different users, with different needs, all the time. These are the typical images that you see in every forest or nature area in the Netherlands. With hiking trails, cycling trails, mountain bike trails, trails for horses. And these signs are meant to navigate, to make sure that these groups do not run into each other and do not have conflicts unnecessarily. And you can do that by designing these trails with the different needs of these different groups in mind. And that works. It works if you plan for those different needs, if you make the mountain bike trail, the designated mountain bike trail, so interesting that there is no reason for a mountain biker to use these other trails, and you can do that with different groups in the same way. Trusting that no one really wants conflicts, and also maybe accepting that every once in a while there will be conflicts because you cannot have a police standing next to every tree in the forest. We do that here, and we accept that this is a fairly well-working way of navigating landscape within groups of different needs. And I want to pose the question, can this be a model in which we can live together with other species as well? I think with wolves we can. And fences play an important role with that. We can use fences, electric fences, to protect our livestock. Because wolves that try to eat sheep, they will quickly have an electric shock, and they will learn that sheep are not easy prey as it might appear in first instance. But it's important then that we think of these fences not as strict boundaries between human landscapes and nature, because that will not work. If a wolf is really keen to go to the other side of a fence, it will find a way. But if you think of fences as communication tools, then it can work differently. Then you can say these fences should be designed in such a way that they send a clear message to wolves. And if you look elsewhere in the world where people live together with wolves or with other difficult animals, we see that there can be a kind of an equilibrium in which the local culture of people using the land and the local culture of animals inhabiting that landscape have become aligned, as it were. where wolves not only learn that protected sheep are unattractive prey, but that they teach that to their young, so that those young will not even try to prey on sheep. That only works, of course, if you do that consistently. So we should maybe also see the protection of sheep not as a matter that individual farmers can do out of self-interest, but we should see it as a collective endeavor in which we as humankind send this clear, unambivalent message to wolves that sheep are off limits. So we should focus on interspecies communication if we want to look for ways of living together with these wild animals. Now, we have to live together with wild animals, but maybe we also have to live together with humans in different positions in the world, because it makes, of course, all the difference in the world if these sheep are yours, or if you live in the city and you have these romantic ideas of wolves coming back to our landscape. Maybe you have this romantic idea that nature is intact again. Now, of course, it makes all the difference in the world, and therefore it's important that we find ways to deal with these problems collectively. One very inspiring example, I think, are groups of volunteers, very often people who like wolves, who then spend their weekend to help farmers and shepherds build these fences. Because they say, well, if you want to protect a wolf, you have to protect sheep. Because if wolves learn to prey on sheep, there will never be a future for wolves, because people will start hating wolves. So here you see this collective endeavor to make a different approach to living together with other beings. Well, the example of wolves might be fairly straightforward, because wolves are smart. Wolves are social beings that can learn the lessons that they learn to their offspring and so forth. It might be a little bit complicated if you look at other species. I've listed a few of the species that we also live with. They also all have their own challenges that can only be met, I think, by studying how these animals live in the world, which kind of signs they understand and which kind of signs they give. For instance, a black-tailed godwin, grutto in Dutch. These are animals that are dependent on the landscape made by humans for other reasons. Well, that might be that might demand a different approach to living together than, for instance, the grey goose that I talked about already, let alone a wild boar that are much more stubborn animals. Most important lesson, I think, that if we want to live together, if you want to do justice to this non-anthropocentric basic attitude towards nature that is on the rise, if you want to get away from the strict anthropocentric view, we have to be aware that there are some essential needs of humans that need to be protected, but we should then look for how to exist with other beings, accept the legitimacy of those species' claim to existence as well. So that means that we have to do one thing: we have to find compromises between human and animal interests. But I think more importantly, we have to understand and become more aware of the fact that we live in a landscape that is occupied by other species as well, experienced and interpreted by other species as well. So wildlife management, for instance, should not be aimed merely at controlling wild animals and limiting the damage that they do, but should be part of this larger quest of finding a nature-inclusive society. There's one picture that I want to close with, a picture by one of the rewilding organizations in Europe, that basically depicts the history of mankind. They say, well, on the top left, you can see how human life and nature was intertwined intimately in the past. With modernization, these two systems basically got separated from each other. And today we are looking at new modern ways to be able again to live together with these animals in a totally new way than we did in the past, because we have modern technology, we have all kinds of new ways to find modes of coexistence. Most important thing, if you want to do that, is to see nature not as this place that you can visit. in the weekend, but that you can accept that we are part of nature and that the landscape that we occupy is the same landscape in which wild animals live. Okay, that was my story. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this very inspiring talk. I can imagine that people are burning to ask a question, and so I would like to invite Niklas. You do the chat. Niklas is the co-organizer of this session. Is there anything in the chat that you want to bring up, or maybe you have a question yourself? Please.
Yes, thanks, Martin. Thanks, Ronald. There was comments in the chat early on, and I've got one question for you, Martin. But first of all, thank you for your intervention. I've learned about rats in the sky, fences as communication tools, or interspecies communication. So a lot of good insights there. One thing I want to ask you is this shared space philosophical perspective. How would you see this also in organization? Not only in nature, but can those principles also apply in organization? And not between human and nature, perhaps, but among nature, among humans. How would you see the parallel between those two, or if there is one, actually?
Well, that's a challenging question. I would think maybe the first thing to start with is not have a command and control organization, but an organization that is aware of, let's say, different needs and different layers of an organization, that is willing to be open to that. And of course, that's easier said than done, because you also want people within an organization to commit to a similar goal, or to a shared goal. With us and wild animals, that shared goal is coexistence, low conflict coexistence. Something like that should be in an organization as well. I can imagine that there is a point in which you have to say to some parts of your organization, or some people working in your organization, if this is what you want, you probably should look elsewhere for your future, because this is what you want is not compatible with what we want collectively. Well, maybe that would be the start. I'm not an organization philosopher, so I'm a little bit challenged for this question. But
can I join in the debate for a moment? It has to do with organization, but on a different level. You are also invited by government agencies to talk to them about your views. How can your view about the wild and the livings, how can that be made into a policy? What sort of policy or sort of guidelines or rules do you have? For example, if you extrapolate what you said about land animals to how we deal with sea animals, what sort of policies should involve, do you recommend? Do you have any general ideas for that? What do we do? See, the question about sea animals might be even more complicated. But in land animals, I think what is important there is that you realize that these are in core social issues. So if we want to make this transition into a nature-inclusive society, we should think of it as a social transition in which we should help everyone to go along with that. So the example of the sheep farmers means, yes, we should help them protect their sheep, and maybe we should not only pay them for their losses, but support them and give them the idea that they are not alone, that people have solidarity with their worries, and a willingness to help them with their worries. On the other hand, I think you can demand from these people then that they also accept that there is a huge portion of the population that is willing to find ways of coexistence with wild animals. So they shouldn't frustrate this collective endeavor, because they think that their apparent self-interest cannot be met in that way. Okay. So they are legitimate in their worries, and they are legitimate in their demand or the request for assistance. But in the end, we should find collective ways of doing this. Right.
So there's much more social science going on for this than merely conservation science.
I
or
imagine.
biologists.
Yeah, it is. I think in your book, you talked about the divide that we see globally between cities and what's the English word?
Urban areas.
Urban areas, rural areas. It's a sort of global phenomenon, and I think this issue of the wolf fits in there.
It's true. Although I think it's important to recognize, especially in a context like the Netherlands, that is also the easiest answer to say, well, this is just a clash between rural areas and urban areas, whereas in fact the Netherlands doesn't have rural areas to speak of, because everyone lives within 20 kilometers of a fairly big city in the Netherlands. And there are social science research that shows that a lot of these divides run right through communities. So even in small villages, there's a large portion of people who want to be ecocentric. But it's a nice way to frame the issue, because there is something going on, I think. That is that there is a growing group in our society who feels that their needs are no longer met. Not only that, but that their needs are not understood by what then is called the global elite, or the people in the city, or so I had a master student who did research on wolf conflicts in the north of Italy, in the part where the wolves have just arrived a couple of years ago, just like here. And she talked to mountain farmers about that, and what they said is, so they started complaining about the wolves, but they did that in the very same sentence as where they were complaining about about Brussels and about refugees and about the downsides of globalization. So these people felt that their way of living was under threat, and that they didn't have a say in that.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's an important question, and that's not about wolves. Wolves are merely a nice symbol to talk about these things. And because it's so controversial.
The wolves are a scapegoat.
Of course there are real problems connected to wolves. So it's more than merely a symbol. But I think if you want to understand why these conflicts are so fierce and so why people can be so emotional about these conflicts, it has to do with that. That there's much more going on.
Okay, thank you.
And Martin, if I may jump, you mentioned also northern of Italy. I'm right now in France, actually. Do you see also differences in geography comparing those type of issues? Is there also an influence from different culture on looking at these issues?
Geography in the fullest sense of the word, I think. So that's geography as in cultural geography, which a landscape and the local culture are somehow are intertwined in a very particular way. The example of France is interesting, because back in the old days, people who had livestock in the mountains went up with that livestock and stayed there for the summertime, guarding their livestock. Whereas 150 years ago, when wolves and other predators were extinct, there was no need for that. So farmers got used to sending their livestock up in the hills or up in the mountains and getting them back 3 months later without staying there. And what happened, the real tragedy, I would say, is that they didn't know immediately when wolves were coming back from Italy, entering France, preying on sheep, and it took a very long time before farmers started realizing that was happening. And in that time, wolves, there was a whole new generation of wolves, and wolves taught to their young that sheep are the preferred prey rather than wild prey. So there you see the opposite of what I was mentioning about human culture and animal culture that can come together and that can converge. There you saw the opposite, that there is a wolf culture that basically enforces the problem, that wolves learn that sheep are good prey. And what you now see is that farmers have to readapt again their way of farming. They are not used to that anymore, and it's way less economically feasible to stay up in the mountains. But the most important thing is that you have to change to wolf culture again. and we know from humans how different it is to change a culture. So that's and now we see even that wolves from France coming north to Belgium and the Netherlands, that they behave slightly different than the wolves coming from Poland and Germany, who are much more used to protected livestock. So so there is this strange historical amalgam with place culture, animal culture, human culture.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
And Martin, there is a question from the chat. From actually André Nauf, who is a professor of stewardship at Nijrode, so it's an interesting perspective from André as well. He's wondering as well, of course, the series is about challenging current assumptions of society. So, or actually giving a different perspective. What is for you the key assumptions that you would like people to look from a different eye, looking at shared spaces or looking at the metaphor of the wolves or the example of the wolves for it? What is the key assumptions that you want to challenge? That's the question of André.
I think the most important assumption would be that this dualistic assumption that humans are so fundamentally different in their way of using space than with other animals, that we come to assume, most often implicitly, that nature is over there and that it can be separated from culture. And I think that's really a very tragic, mistaken view, because of course, once you start looking differently with this assumption in mind, you look around you, and even in the most cultured, most cultivated places, you can see that there is wildness going on. Even here we have in a high-tech studio, in a concrete building, in a virtual environment. But probably if you look more closely, and zoom in, you will see that there are all kinds of little creatures, microscopic creatures, eating stuff. And once you stop taking care of your house, it will fall down within a couple of decades. So maybe, that's a bleak view, but it is a view that can make us maybe more susceptible for the fact that where we are, other life is as well. And that also makes us susceptible for the idea that we shouldn't have a Disney view of nature, because a lot of things in nature are out to get us. They consider us as food. Maybe in Corona we should have learned that as well. There are these viruses that have however small they are, they have this power to totally disrupt our society. So this idea that we live in a human society and that nature is out there, I think is the most pressing issue that we should correct.
Thank you. Martin, you're here in a business school. Most welcome. As an environmental philosopher, you know what environmental philosophers think, what people who have non-anthropocentric views think, and who've given that a lot of thought. What's the view of business actually in this intellectual milieu?
I think twofold. One is this ecosystem service approach. I was fairly critical about that, but I nevertheless think it's a hugely important development, in which even economists say, if economy is about, let's say, rationalizing the way in which we meet needs, we should make these cost and benefit analysis more complete by seeing what nature brings, what are hidden costs, and so that started off as a theoretical endeavor. My problem is still that I think there's more to it than merely this economic debate, but within the context of the economy, I think it's hugely important, and there are companies starting now to plead for that. Yeah. Because if you are, let's say, if you want to be a responsible company, you have to compete with those companies that do not pay those hidden costs. So there are gradually companies starting to plead for this real price approach, for instance. They're just really in line with this ecosystem service approach. I think it's hugely important. And it's basically the rational thing to do, I would say. Yeah. The only worry that I sometimes have is that this talk about ecosystem service is so dominant that it pushes away all those other kind of ways of thinking that we also have. So yes, within economy this is important, but we are more than merely economical beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
But having said that, I think this is hugely important, and luckily there are companies starting to do this.
That's right.
And taking this seriously, and I hope that this will grow.
So we have to learn, just like the wolves have to learn.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Nicolas, what do you think? A last word? Otherwise I'll ask Martin for a last word and then we come to a close.
Yeah, I think we should come to a close, and I will, just before you close, Ronald, I will announce the next speaker as well. So I will give you the floor, Martin and Ronald, for the last one.
Okay, and then you announce the next speaker.
Yes, I will.
Okay, then maybe do you want to?
I don't have much to add, but other than thanks again for having this opportunity to
Wonderful, yeah.
to share ideas.
Yeah, thanks for being with us and teaching us a real lesson. That's what we invite radical thinkers for. I found it very inspiring. I think it's very inspiring for our business school. At business schools, we tend to think about the bottom line and the business case. I think we should try to make up our minds about how we can integrate this in business thinking, or how we can integrate business thinking into your environmentalism. So thank you so much once more. Nicolas, you want to announce our next speaker?
Yes, so our first speaker actually was on degrowth. Second speaker, Martin, was on the place of human among the livings. Our third speaker, we will actually go to another side of our society, which is corporate law. And we will invite actually a professor from the University of Oslo, Beate Schaffel. I'm sure she will pronounce her name much better than I do, but she will also talk us about radicality in corporate law. So the next conference will be in June. We will welcome you all back in June. And Ronald, I think it's now time to close the second Radical Thinker conference.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then herewith I call this session closed. Thanks everyone for watching, and I hope to meet you at the third meeting.